Hello, everybody. I was already introduced, but let me introduce my team again. So my name is Monika Sowinska. I work at the European Commission's Directorate for Informatics in the Interoperability Unit. I am responsible, among other things, for OSOR, that is European Commission's Open Source Observatory. Today, I am joined by two members of the OSOR team. We have a very young, dynamic team, and it's much bigger. But today, I am joined by Clare O'Donohoe and Vivien Devenyi, consultants from Waystone that support Commission in implementing this project. And we will talk about the observatory and its role in supporting public administration, specifically in adopting open source. We would like to thank you, LATA associations and Yannis Stoupolis, for inviting us to join this event and giving us the opportunity to present OSOR and our work. I might need to switch my camera off because I see that there is some problem with my connection in the meantime. So sorry for that. I really have to do it to save on the bandwidth. So what we are going to discuss in the next 20 minutes. First, I will give you examples of EU programs and actions supporting the adoption of open source to give some broader context of our work. Then I'm going to introduce you OSOR, and after that, Claire will talk about the OSOR Knowledge Center, which will be followed by information about our work on open source policy reports. Vivien then will take the floor to present the guidelines for sustainability open source communities that OSOR team put together and published last year. We will close with our plans for the future. Next slide, please. So, although currently, as you may probably know, there is no European policy on open source, and shaping of these policies are at the discretion of member states, there have been a variety of EU programs and initiatives funding and encouraging the development and uptake of open source software. For example, under Horizon 2020, the Next Generation Internet Program has supported already over 300 open source projects, steering the evolution of the internet towards EU values and principles, such as openness, inclusiveness, protection and privacy, and sustainability. The program was designed to attract top talent and innovators that typically, as you know, come from open source communities. Also, I would like to mention a series of programs focusing on the interoperability of public services, namely IWC, ISA, and ISA Square, as these are programs that have funded OSOR and other projects promoting open source among public administrations. Another extremely important initiative is the UPL, European Public License. It is a free open software license created and approved by the European Commission back in 2007. The license is available in 23 official languages. That's what makes her unique. And it's legally consistent with the copyright law of all EU member states and compatible with other popular open source licenses. Its purpose is to encourage public administrations to embrace the free and open source software and make this process easier. You may have heard about EU FOSSA project, free and open source software auditing. It was proposed by the European Parliament and later launched by the European Commission after the discovery of Heartbeat back in 2014. The follow-up program project, EU FOSSA, focused on exploring innovative methods to find and fix open source vulnerabilities. The European Commission also organizes a lot of events that focus on open source. I listed here some examples that were organized in 2019 and 2013. And finally, I would like to turn to the upcoming Digital Europe program. Grants under this program will provide a lot of opportunities for projects based on the open source solutions. The program will focus on building essential capacities and advanced skills in key digital technology areas. And this will contribute to Europe's technological sovereignty and accelerate their deployment and best use in areas of public interest and the private sector too. We will also promote further interoperability under this program. And next slide, please. So why I am solutions for public administrations, business and citizens, in short ISA Square, because it is the program that actually currently funds OSOR and a lot of other open source projects or projects promoting open source. Its aim is to identify, create and operate digital solutions and frameworks so that public administrations and citizens in Europe can benefit from interoperable cross-border and cross-sector public services. Here I listed some projects and also the platform, Join Up Collaborative Platform, that actually is a platform in which we upload all our solutions, and it also serves e-government professionals who want to share experience, share their experience and their solutions. It also hosts several observatories, and among them OSOR. I also wanted to draw your attention to open. I was still, sorry, back to the previous slide. So licensing, as you know, for open source, it's a quite important aspect. And we have on JoinUp 2 very useful practical tools, JoinUp Licensing Assistant and License Compatibility Checker, that are useful for both developers and IT managers. And I encourage you to check them on JoinUp. Today, we don't have time to talk about them. Under the same program, my colleagues have recently launched 3 open source bug bounties, and awards to 5,000 euros are available for finding security vulnerabilities in Element, Moodle, and Zimbra, open source solutions used by public service across the EU. And next slide, please. I have just one more information before we move to really work of OSOR. I would like to draw your attention to the event organized by Open Forum Europe, this open source advocacy group. And during this event, EU Open Source Policy Summit, that will take place already tomorrow afternoon, the results of an important study will be presented. The study on the impact of open source software and of open hardware on the EU economy was commissioned by another directorate of the Commission, DG Connect. And the study is expected to come up with recommendations on the strategic role of open source in the future open European policies and programs. So this is definitely something that open source advocates and enthusiasts in both public and private sector should follow. Next slide, please. So now it's time to tell you more about OSOR. It is hosted, as I mentioned, on JoinUp Collaborative Platform. Its mission is to provide open source expertise and information and to serve as middle ground for connecting European public administrations with other stakeholders. We are also playing a very active role in the open source community by promoting open source and helping European public administrations with adoptions in different ways, which we'll talk about in the next slides. Apart from providing a multitude of useful resources, we regularly organize workshops and webinars and attend events in Europe. By doing this, we are constantly working to develop closer ties to the community and keep OSOR relevant to your needs. And what we can find on OSOR, it's quite varied. Our observatory, it includes news on the latest developments in open source in public sector. We publish them regularly. Every week you will find something new. By the way, you can set up an RSS feed. We provide event listing for OSOR, so our events, and other open source events. We regularly publish case studies on the deployment of open source software within public administrations. You can also access our monthly newsletter, and I invite you to sign up because you will get then a regular update in your email box. There is a subscription link at the bottom of the homepage. And finally, there is our knowledge center that gives access to a variety of resources. Its content is being constantly updated and developed. We publish there also our studies and our work. And now it is Claire's turn to tell you more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Monika. So I'm going to tell you all about the OSOR Knowledge Centre and what you can find within the Knowledge Centre. So the Knowledge Centre's content is continuously updated, and it's also open to contributions by the community, and we encourage you to do this. But at the moment, what we have on the Knowledge Centre, we have our guidelines for creating sustainable open source software communities, and we have case studies on the use of open source software in public administrations, a list of associations, competence centres, and points of contact that work with open source. There's a very nice list of open source repositories. So they either contain software developed for public administrations or even by public administrations. And one of the key features as well is our country intelligence on open source software policies in Europe. And I'm going to tell you all about that now. So the open source software country intelligence reports are a major feature of the Knowledge Centre. So the reports contain research on open source software policies in European countries, and we're focusing on topics such as the governance, political and legal frameworks, and any major ongoing open source software initiatives in the public sector. So in order to compile these reports, we started out by carrying out desk research, and then we validated our research findings with national contact points in the countries where possible. So in some instances where we couldn't find a contact point, the content of the report is based off publicly available information. And once we had compiled 28 reports, so it was for the 27 EU member states and the United Kingdom, we then compiled all of our analysis and we put together a consolidated report that was giving an overview of the status of open source software in Europe. So the status of this task at the moment, as I said, we have 28 reports published in 2020, and we also had the status report, which I invite you to check out on the Knowledge Centre. And our work is continuing. So we've actually recently launched the worldwide country reports. So we'll be looking at some other European countries and some non-European countries. So please stay tuned for more there. So you might be wondering, with all of this research that we did, what were the key findings from this work? So the main finding that we found across European countries is that the adoption of open source political and legal frameworks is increasing steadily, so at a very nice pace over the last 2 decades. Within the purpose of this research, we identified 100 political and legal frameworks, and this was identified across 26 of the 28 European countries. So there was actually only 2 countries that we found that didn't have a political or legal framework in place. So a very nice finding. And as I said, its adoption is steadily increasing over time. So from 1 initiative in 2001 to 100 initiatives in 2020. And some other key takeaways that we found. So, we are generally aware open source software offers many benefits for the public sector, including transparency, adaptability, and collaborative potential. And the country intelligence reports kind of highlight the impact of this realization. So you're seeing this realization culminating in political and legal frameworks, which is quite nice. You can see that the public sector is open to using open source. And looking to the future, lots of cause for optimism, because we've had the recent publication of the European Commission's open source software strategy and the Berlin Declaration, which was signed by the EU member states. So very optimistic outlook for the future. Now, having carried out this research, we will say, and I repeat myself, but we didn't do all of this work alone. Where possible, we did collaborate with national contact points who had insight on open source software in their home country. And a perfect example of this would be for the Latvian Open Source Software Intelligence Report. So in order to draft this report, OSOR collaborated with LATA in 2020 to gain insights about the following aspects of the use of open source in the Latvian public sector. So it really was quite a great collaboration. Janis and other LATA members provided their insights. They put us in contact with the relevant ministry, Varam, and they also provided insights on another OSOR output. And this is our guidelines on sustainable open source public sector communities. The point we'd like to highlight here is that for this project and for other OSOR projects, we're really striving to engage with the community and work with open source enthusiasts. So now that I've talked about these reports, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Vivien, and she's going to tell you all about these guidelines that I've just mentioned.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. So indeed, I will now present the guidelines, another one of OSOR's biggest achievements. So we can move on to the next slide. So indeed, as Claire just mentioned, open source is very beneficial for any organization that chooses to use it. The public sector can use it for internal processes. They can also use it to deliver digital public services to citizens, for example. And we, of course, would like to see public administrations not only reuse open source software, but also become active members and contributors to the communities that exist around open source software. For this reason, our guidelines, they offer recommendations, tips, and resources for anyone looking to adopt and create open source software in the public sector. And they also provide a step-by-step solution and best practices in order to foster the sustainability and the success of open source projects in the public sector. These guidelines were also made possible through our collaboration with the OSOR community. We launched a survey around this time last year and we received very valuable input. We also held an in-person workshop in the beginning of the year in 2020 and then followed up with a community webinar where we received even more feedback. In addition to the guidelines, we also published an analysis of the success factors of sustainable open source communities in the public sector. In this report, you can learn more about the methodological approach of the guidelines, as well as a literature review that we carried out. And then on OSOR, you can also access 5 case studies on sustainable open source communities. We wrote these following interviews with our community members, and we showcase countries such as Italy, Netherlands, France, Germany, and Finland. And of course, the final result was the completed guidelines. This year, we are launching a feedback mechanism actually in the upcoming weeks. And everyone will be able to comment on the guidelines, share their feedback, and also hopefully tell us how they use these guidelines for their own projects. And following that, later this year, we will publish an updated and revised version of the guidelines. To tell you a bit more detail on what we included, we identified 5 key factors that contribute to the sustainability of open source communities in the public sector. So these are firstly community vibrance. This relates to members' motivation and therefore the community's capacity to retain current members and of course to attract new ones. Then a clear governance structure, which relates to the presence of a clear and transparent process that and procedures within the community. And then the public sector adoption incentives, they include, for example, the support of the political and managerial hierarchy, their awareness of open source software, of course, openness to change and transparency in this case as well. And then technological maturity, it concerns the quality of the software source code as well as its documentation in order to promote reusability and attractiveness of the software. And then finally, sustainable funding, it relates to resource management within the community. We recommend to have a budget not only at the inception of a new project, but also to maintain and develop the software as well as ensure community growth. Our guidelines consist of 3 key chapters. Firstly, setting the foundation for sustainable open source communities and the engagements. We detail the types of questions that public administrations should assess and address before committing to an open source engagement. And then there are 2 general approaches that public administrations can take. They can either join an existing community or create one from scratch. Therefore, the 2nd chapter describes the sustainable way to join an existing community and reuse its software if it meets the public administration's needs. Or you can opt to build your own public sector open source community. And in this chapter, you will find a detailed breakdown of the steps that should be taken, as well as the questions that should be answered in order to build such a community. So now we close our presentation on OSOR's highlights, and we would like to share our next steps with you. As concern our country intelligence reports, we are indeed drafting 16 new ones covering countries from around the globe. For the guidelines, we are launching the feedback mechanism, and we will have a dedicated webinar in the spring, and then we will publish a new version of the guidelines. And we will also continue with our community engagement activities, and we'll launch a series of 3 webinars starting from the spring. So please keep an eye on OSOR for any updates. Please do not hesitate to get in contact if you're interested in our activities, have any feedback or thoughts to share with us. All our details are listed here, and we of course will be very happy to hear from our community members. So indeed, today's presentation was brought to you by Monica, Claire, and myself. So feel free to write us or connect on LinkedIn. And finally, the OSOR team would just like to thank you all for attending our session, and of course to LATA for hosting us. We hope that it was interesting and that you'll join us in the near future.
Thank you, ladies, so much. To be honest, I was a bit skeptic about trio fitting in 20 minutes, but you managed it very well. A few questions from our side. Let's start with a more general one, the COVID-19 situation. How did it influence your community since you work throughout Europe? Was it business as usual, or you had some changes in the processes?
So definitely and I think that nobody can say that it was business as usual, and it affected everybody and every aspect of our life. Since we, of course, in the past worked a lot using in IT technologies, and so for us to switch to that was quite easy. We were happy to use open source solutions for that, for example, Jitsi, and we also promoted this type of tools. Our team also participated in a new project of the Commission, which was another kind of observatory, if I may say, or collection. We call it on JoinUp, that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is digital response to COVID-19. And we collected there open source solutions or open hardware solutions, but also websites, platforms, tools, mainly open source, that actually helped to survive, overcome, or mitigate crises caused by pandemics. So when it comes to our communities, they just become more busy. You know, they work intensified, and also it's the same about us. And actually, my directorate that I work at the Commission, it was a very intense period, and it still is.
Could you please name some practical examples in Europe about open source and the communities, just to understand a bit better the whole concept?
So the whole concept. So there was a presentation on open source. So you know, there is the basic differentiation that you have open source and proprietary source software. And open source software can be modified, you can study, it can be shared freely, and so on. So our part of work is to promote the concept of using open source software and sharing IT solutions among public administrations, which actually result in decreasing cost, you know, efficiency in many areas, increasing efficiency in many areas in terms of times and other resources. And then the question is, you know, you have, we all use open source, for example, in our mobile operating system, Android, if you are using that one, not a product of Apple, it's open source. It's present in everyday life. I suppose that members of LATA and today's audience, they heard about Linux, for example. So, you know, that we could spend now 30 minutes listing different solutions, but focus on our work, it's to really promote the use of open source solutions by public sector. And we have very good examples in many countries. And these are actually our reports that Claire was talking about. They list both policy and legal frameworks that facilitate this use of open source by public administration, but also we list practical applications, so different initiatives. So I encourage you to look at them, because I could now list the examples of Italy or France that are very advanced in this respect, and they have a lot of open source communities. So communities that are built around the software that is either developed by public administrations, or public administration use open source software, and also they are involved in communities around it.
Mm-hmm. Reading the comments in Slido, it's obvious that not all of our participants in today's conference are familiar with your community. So what would be the easiest way for them to follow? Is it your website? I mean, to read the reports and stuff, or some social media? What would you suggest?
So we are, so OSOR, it's an observatory. And when we use word community, just to clarify, because we can talk about open source communities around particular software, but we can also, we are talking about community of OSOR. So all those people that are interested in promoting or using open source, or they just want to get some information about it or work with us. And here in the presentation, actually we have hyperlinks, but in one of the slides, I think we also added a link that you can see, and by copying it, you can access OSOR that it's hosted on JoinUp. The easiest thing is either type osor.eu, and you will be directed to this link, or go to JoinUp. So the same, you just type JoinUp, and then you look for OSOR. And I really encourage you, it's a really plethora of information on JoinUp itself. There are other observatories, but our observatory is hosted there. So the starting point is just to visit our observatory. Then you have all the information, so email that you can contact us, and news items that I mentioned. You can set up an RSS feed, sign up for newsletter, and so on. So this is the best way to get involved and get in touch with us.
Yeah, sounds good enough. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.